Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. Nice to have you here. Let's begin. Please turn off your cell phones, fasten your seatbelt, and we're off. Oh. Little technical issues. Yeah. Let me introduce myself. My name is Piotr Mistygacz, but my friends call me Quasi. And I am senior level designer at Techland. Let me tell you what I do. Starting off my job, I'm the part of interdisciplinary team devoted to create and implement story elements for our upcoming game. I can't tell you much about this game right now, but believe me, I can wait for the time that I will be able to do that. My life doesn't revolve only about the work. For what is most important for me, I'm the proud father of these two lovely kids and the husband of most wonderful woman in the world. And there was a moment in my career that I decided to share my knowledge and experience with the others. So I start lecturing at private and public universities. And from about 2 years, I have a privilege to co-organize and host one of the best meetups in the world, game dev meetups. I mean, Wrocław game dev meetups. Before we go on, I want to share with you my story, how I get into the game dev. And this, what you see on this screen, is not my first game. I'm not that old. But the funny thing is that the game was released in the year that I was born. This was the first game I ever played. This game showed me how games can be immersive and how they can feed our imagination. And from that moment, games became an integral part of my life. And let's fast forward a couple of years. In 2005, when I was finishing my studies, I have no idea what I'm gonna do for the living. So help came from one of the articles covering game dev. It was in one of my favorite periodicals, Physics Extreme. And I found that one of the companies in Wrocław is looking for people to help them make games. So I decided to try, and they gave me my first task. And how my first desk task, which was my first level, was created is a very funny story, but a lot of the details of this story are not appropriate for events such like this. But what I can tell you, that the most important parts of this story was my father-in-law, his camper van, about 6 bottles of cheap champagne, awful hangover, and not enough time. But as you probably figured out already, I got the job. I became the part of the level design team. I took my first steps designing levels for the game called Warhound. The game was never released, but I managed to learn a lot back then. And after that, I went to the Wild West with brothers McCall in the Call of Juarez series. And what followed were zombies from Dead Island to Dying Light, the following game. And all those games were very valuable lessons for me. I learned how to design levels for games with a linear structure and more open world. And also I learned how to design games for one and several players. And this is also true for the game that we are already working on. And I guess it wouldn't hurt anyone if I show you what are we working on. You wouldn't tell anyone, right? This is a joke. You have to wait a little longer for that, but I hope not as long as Valve keep us waiting for the next Half-Life game, so stay alert. And now I will tell you a little bit about this talk, 10 years, 10 lessons learned. 10 most important things for me that keeps me in game dev for 10 years and wants me to stay for a little longer. Not all of them are connected with level design. Probably most of them are covering the daily jobs of every game creator. And I'm aware that this topic might look similar to one that Mark Rosewater did a few years ago at GDC, but he's got 20 years, 20 lessons. I wanted to do the same, but I just couldn't wait for that. So let's go. Try to keep everything under control. Some time ago, I asked my fellow designers, developers to describe the game development process using one word. They were very creative. A lot of ideas were not appropriate for events like this. My favorite is foobar, taken from military slang, but I think the chaos is best fitting for this talk. And by the chaos, I mean all the creative chaos caused by the creative minds involved in the game creation. This chaos accompanies us from the very start of the game till the end of the production. Naturally, we want to do everything to keep this chaos more organized. Producers and leads try to describe all the creative processes into spreadsheets. And leads, of course, try to channelize this creative power into one right direction. And I made a connection for that, and herding wild horses through the prairies. The devs, us, of course, are the beautiful wild stallions, while leads and producers are the cowboys who try to be on the top of this situation and bring this herd to the destination before the sundown. And of course, time is running up, night is coming, herd is running all over the direction. So whatever happens, we cannot completely remove the chaos from our daily activities, daily jobs. So if we can remove chaos from our life, we can try to tame it, we can try to put an order on it, try to control it. And I must admit that there were a moment in my life where a number of tasks, the private and in the task at work, were a little bit overwhelming. It was, everything goes under control. And the help came from the book I've received. I started working in game dev. This book was called Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy. This is probably the only book that I can recommend you that didn't overwhelm us with something I like to call corporate bullshit. This book taught me that organizing my work can bring a peace into my daily activities, and especially planning out my work. And one of my favorite tools are the simple to-do lists. And I use two types of them, paper and digital one. The paper one, like this, it's a real actual to-do list I've done recently. I made it for tasks that need to be done right here, right now, for example, things that need to be fixed in the part of the game that we are already playing on. And the second one, the digital list, saved somewhere in the cloud. I use for more complicated tasks, more time-consuming, the things I can forget. And there's a lot of apps on the market, like Wunderlist, Todoist. I test a lot of them, but I find Nozbe is best fitting for my needs. And there's a thing that we could learn from the chefs. And before we start working on a task, chefs got the rule called mise en place. In French, it means everything in a place. That means that before they start making a dish, they try to gather all the ingredients and the tools that they will need for that within the reach. And for me, it means that before I start working on more complicated tasks, I gather as much information as I can to move on. It means how much time I get for this, who is responsible for what. This leads us to the second lesson: don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of quotes, phrases that describe this problem, and they all remind me that we shouldn't try so hard to be another Steve Jobs of the game development. And what we must learn is to use skillfully existing elements. And we should learn to take inspiration and ideas from things that were created by the others, especially the good ones. The bad ones we should avoid or know how to fix. And it's not about the killing creativity but feeding it. And because I believe that in our industry, innovation comes from unexpected connections of already existing things that can give us something new, something fresh. And there's a little story. This guy on the screen is Rupert, main character of one of the quests I made for Dying Light. The idea for the story even won one of our internal competition. This was my idea. I won. I was very proud of myself. I felt myself like a game dev prodigy. The story was about one elder man who take care about the kids, and he convinced them that he's a magician. All the bad things around is just magic, and they were safe with him. And when it comes to the actual work on this quest, some of my friends brought out the fair point that something that seems to be my idea actually was a clever reinterpretation of one of the Oscar-winning movie called Life is Beautiful. So back then I learned that the inspiration can work in very funny ways, and I started using them more consciously. And while looking for inspiration, it's very important to not ignore other media. It's useful to look outside of the games, research movies, literature, comics, books, paintings, and of course the real life. And this is something I learned from Mateusz Piaskiewicz. It's good to build own database of references that we can use in the future. And for me, it's just a cluster of photos, notes in my books, everything that will help me to overcome the blockage if I experience that. And it's also good to boost. It's also a good way to boost our creativity. And using the existing elements is also useful to visualize our ideas, and they really help to communicate better with the people. And through those years, I met people who were in love with one game, and believe me, it was really hard to discuss with them new ideas because they got only the one game in their minds. So my advice is to try to explore new genres of games, try to be more open-minded for games, and play consciously. And what does I mean by that? And since I start working in game dev, I can play games just for fun. Every time I see something on screen, I automatically analyze it. And if I find something, some things that are bad, I try to think how can I fix them, and when I find things that were good, I automatically add them to my reference database so I can use them in the future. I take a lot of screenshots while I'm playing games and take a lot of notes. I'm also not a believer of a thing called playing on YouTube. For me, creating games in the sense of learning how to drive means that we cannot learn to drive car just looking through the windows and observe traffic. So watching someone else play, we see only one of the many ways the game can be played, and we can feel the mechanics of the game. And this is my tip for you. If you're looking for good inspiration, good design decision, good design overall, it's good to look at the Nintendo games. They were experts in many aspects of the design. And since we're in the topic of design, for me, design should always start on the paper. For me, creating games, especially designing them, is a long, treacherous road. And it's good to be prepared. it's good to have a plan, especially on a paper. And for me, the paper, I not only mean the paper, physical paper, but also all the documents we can prepare before we start the journey. I love the paper because it is the first place that my ideas materialize, they evolve, they changed. And according to the principle that one picture is worth 10,000 words, for me it's useful to also visualize my ideas, and it really helps to get this idea across the other. And I doodle a lot. As you can see, this is through a few pages from my notebook, and I cross things out. Because changes made on the paper are very cheap, and they take no time. So if it turns out that the idea is worthless, we can just start the page and throw them away. The paper has another very important role for me. It serves a clue of the things that I want to achieve in the next step of design. So it's useful to write down the most important things for us that we want to achieve in the games, in the levels that we want to design. So we won't lose focus on that things, because making games is, as I mentioned, a chaos. This is something that I encourage my students to do. And a great example for me is Sam Barlow. When he was working on her story, he wrote down the most important things for him, and every time he needs to decide if the elements can stay or need to be ditched, he just compare it with this list. If it was true, the elements stay. And it's also good to know when enough is enough, especially when to finish working on a paper. And for me, is the moment that I gather enough information to move to the next steps. By the next step, I mean prototype. And for me, it's a little like furniture building. Try to imagine that you start working in a workshop without any measurements, without any sketches. It's easy to imagine that you will lose a lot of material and time for all the necessary iteration. And it's also not very smart to create whole game on the paper. Yeah, this is the true story. Because there was a moment in development process of our current game where we're unable to work in our editor, because a lot of the tools that we are using right now were made from the scratch. So we tried to design things on the paper, and the problem was that we actually started to resolve problems on the paper that will be in the next steps, that leads us to more documents, more text that no one wants to read, and the help come from simple graphs that help us to visualize ideas, especially for me, for the quest that we want to make. And the knowing is the half of the battle. And the bottom line is that also paper should keep ours and the others designers' ambitions and aspirations at the bay. And we should learn to say this is good enough, and we can move on to the next step. And by the next step, I mean prototype. And yeah, prototypes should be as ugly as possible. I already mentioned you that I organize and host meetups, rules of game dev meetups. And one of them, I asked my fellow designers to discuss their experience with prototype. And that what said, Jakub really sums up the problem that I experienced for all the years of working on games. Because the more work and soul we put into the prototype, it is harder to change those elements, and especially to remove them if they were bad. So it's good to remember that prototypes are made for the purpose. This purpose is to test our assumptions that we made on the paper in the previous step. and not treat them as a real game. And this is one of mine ugly prototypes. Some of those blocks are the important characters, the others are the important locations. And this is the very early part of the prototyping. It's just things that help me to make sure that the things that we design on the paper will work in our game. And similar to the paper iterations, those are still quick and don't require a lot of time. Yeah, I need a little drink. Yeah, this is something that I like to call the player shoes. Before we move on, I would like you to share this quote, especially the last sentence. Because for me, being a designer is a very schizophrenic experience. Because if you want our work to be good, we need to be at the same time the designer and the recipient. And the recipient in this context of game making means player. And let's think about the difference between the player and developer. And I don't mean the working hours and the size of the page again, crippling depression. For me, the biggest difference between the player is the knowledge about the game. Because the player will play the game for the first time. All the knowledge about the game world will be built upon his experience from the previous hours of game, not years of game making. And which is the problem for us developers. So one of the many problems as we creators can face off is losing the distance to our creation. And this problem has a name. The QA department call it issue of familiarity. So we start to get bored and forget about the player. We make a lot of iterations just for ourselves to make feel better playing the games. And those changes can lead to the frustration of future player, and this is something that we want to achieve being designers. So what we can do about it? There's one simple thing. We can just take a break, do something else. It's a good way to look at the things with a fresh eye. Or we can do something else, something more valuable. We can ask someone else for help, for feedback. And when it comes to feedback, I think the biggest problem is the fear of criticism, and in my case, the fear of inevitable changes. That means more work. And let's not forget that the best designers work in the field, and by the field work, I mean working with the players, listening to their opinions and iterating the product until will be the best fitted for them. So we try to play our game a lot during the development. Together we can catch a lot of bugs, and also we are well synchronized about the things that we are doing as well. And when we talk about making games and the issues, it's hard not to mention the QA department. And in Techland, we try at least have one experienced QA in our interdisciplinary team, because this gives us someone that we can just give him a piece of our work and get a very useful feedback. And we need to remember that after a while, even experienced tester will lose, will become less objective about the problems. And it is very important to look for someone with a fresh eye, so we try to find the people who didn't play our game. It's also good to remember that the list of the problems, issues that we need to fix is just the first step. The next step is the iteration that will bring us closer to the thing that we design on the paper. And we have to remember that this iteration can take a while, sometimes even after the game is released. Feedback is a very vast problem. and it's probably the longest lesson here. There's a couple of things that I think is worth mention. When we are in the position of someone who receives feedback, first and foremost, we should pay attention to the feedback. And if we encounter a problem, we shouldn't start to fix it already. It's good to ask the right questions about the problem, because often it turns out that the real problem is in the different place that the reported issue. And if we were in the situation where we're giving feedback, I think that the most important thing is to comment about the things that are in our field of expertise and be as much specific with our feedback. I remember that when we were working on Dying Light, there were a moment where I received a lot of feedback, and even from producers. And the I have a big problem with that. I received accepted feedback for the same thing from the producers, and of course they were producers and they thought that those things need to be fixed right now. And that was the moment where I said enough is enough, and it was too much for me. So from that moment, all their feedback I use only as a suggestion of things that I can fix, because this weren't their field of expertise. And this quote is borrowed from architecture. It's for us, the developers, especially designers, is better well known as the gameplay first. As a level designer, I often work with the people responsible for the visual side of the levels. We call them level artists at Techland. And it's the common ground for fights. Because for level artists, the most important thing is to make the levels, the areas that we are working on, as much realistic as they can be. And for level designers, the gameplay is the most important things. So that's why every time I start working on prototypes, I talk with level artists, and because their knowledge and expertise on this stage is very important for me, like in the other steps. And when we are on the same page, we can do better things, and they can help me with design. And also, the moment when I learned that the importance and the power of interdisciplinary team, because when you separate those two and they start working on their own agendas, there will be a blood. And but when they start working in the same team, hand with hand, and they can create amazing things. I want to share with you one simple thing that I experienced during designing my levels. While I was designing, I try to always use as much elements that can help me to lead player into the right direction. And one thing that I learned through those years is that's just it's not about the 100% sure. I can be 100% sure that he will go in that direction, but I just increase the odds. And what is most important, using the elements that will help me with that, like light, FX, sound, should be used only for this purpose, not to confuse the player. Yeah, something that's very important for me. And I started to love that chart recently, because when I was at the beginning of my career, I do a lot of things intuitively. So the things, if they works, just they works. And after a while, I start to thinking, why one thing work and the other not? And this was the moment that I realized how much I need to learn to honestly say that I know what I'm doing. And even though I don't have much time, which you know already, I'm father of 2 kids, I try to constantly develop my skills. I try to use every moment to learn something, to gain more knowledge. And besides this stuff like reading books and articles about the game dev, I try to listen a lot of podcasts because I think they were a very good way to learn something. And don't worry, all the things that I show you here will be tweeted on my Twitter account in a while. And this slide is my tribute to the people that I admire, and the people that I think, if you are interested in level design, you should follow and support. First one, Mateusz Piaskiewicz, the guy that with whom I had a pleasure to work with for many years. He spent a lot of his free time to popularize the knowledge about level design and teaching level design. And the next gentleman, the Max Pierce and his level design lobby, which is probably the must-hear thing for all the level designers. And last but not least, Przegranie initiative hosted by Tomasz Gob, the great source of knowledge about the game dev, especially in Poland. So let's keep fingers crossed for those people, and because thanks to them we have a really good and easy access to the very valuable knowledge. And that leads us to the point that the conclusion that most of the things that we can learn, we learn from the others. And for me, making games is very hard to do it alone. And the day has only 24 hours. We can split them into two equal parts. And let's say the first part is for work. The second part is for family, friends, for us. And the second part is for, I don't know, gaming, sleeping, regenerating ourselves. And for me, as a level designer, the first 8 hours of a day, the work hours, are the moments that I communicate a lot with different people from different departments, from the things that I need to do. And it's turns out that things called the soft skills became very important in my and the others' everyday life and work. And this is also a thing that I find out very common problem for game dev. It's just trust in competences, because I found this is very crucial for our work, and it's not easy, but it really helps if we know people that we work with more. I know it's time-consuming, but when we learn the strong and weak sides of the people that we work with, will really help us in the future, especially to delegate the task to the right people. And the next 8 hours is probably more important for us than the previous one. For me, if after work I go into full father and husband mode, I never take my work with me. And so don't forget to invest this time for yourself, to develop, to learn, and become better people. And I hope I didn't sound like a life coach. Is this end? No. I tricked you. It's been 11 years since I started working in game dev. And when I sent out proposal for this talk, I didn't thought that it will be 11 years already. So I have one more lesson for you. It will be short, don't worry. Nothing is obvious. This is actually one of the last lessons I learned. I remember talking with Małgorzata Mitręga. I don't know if you met her. She's probably one of the best producers in the game dev. We've discussed the problem of communication between our two departments, and she helped me to understand that some things that are obvious for our team are not like that for the other, and vice versa. So it was good lessons for me. And this is one of the examples of problem with communication. During the development of Dying Light DLC, the following, someone ordered small clearing with just a small altar for the purpose of cutscene, and after a few days he received this. So it was hard for us to delete it. It is just stay in the game. We must not forget that the different professions use different tools, different lingo. So it's also good to remember to repeat ourselves and paraphrase the things that we are talking about. It's better to do that than to leave the holes that someone else can fill with their own interpretation. Also, the words should be clear. I recently have a problem with communication problem with programmers responsible for the or dialogue systems. We have constant problem with defining which is barks and which are the chatters. So I know that before I start talking with them, I need to be clear what are we talking about right now. And if you're interested in communication problems and dealing with it, I recommend you to go to Michal Vnuk lecture tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And yes, that was my 11 lessons. I hope you enjoyed and find some of them useful for you. And I also advise you to stay in this room for the next lecture when Tomasz Pruski will tell you about his experience as a narrative designer. So thank you, Iga, for those beautiful pictures for my presentation, all the support. And thank you guys for coming here. Thank you. I thought it will take much longer.
Yes. Do you have any questions?
So you can ask me if you meet me on the hall, whatever. I will be glad to answer your questions after that.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Piotr Mistygacz.
Thank you.